My mother was the Queen for a very long time. And although you kind of know that this might happen, you don't really think about it very much. Not least of all because the monarchy is about continuity.
The crown's darkest secret just destroyed her. Camilla collapsed the moment Princess Anne read it aloud. Gasps filled the room.
Throughout her life, Her Majesty the Queen, my beloved mother, was an inspiration, an example to me and to all my family. And we owe her the most heartfelt debt any family could owe to their mother.
Doctors rushed in. But what King Charles wrote in his final letter was so devastating, so utterly shocking, that psychologists are now warning of a complete mental breakdown.
Firstly, I'd just like to make the point that we're very...
Palace insiders are whispering about erratic behavior, sleepless nights, and alarming changes no one saw coming. What did Charles reveal that broke the Queen's mind? The gathering had been organized as a simple tribute, a chance for the family to reflect on Charles's life away from the public eye. These private moments are common within the royal family, offering a space where formality can give way to genuine emotion and remembrance. However, those present that day quickly realized this would be no ordinary family meeting. Queen Camilla arrived with the composure that had become her trademark over the years. After decades of navigating public scrutiny and gradually building her position within the royal family, she had every reason to feel secure in her role. Her journey from controversial figure to queen consort had been long and carefully managed, and by all appearances, her influence within the palace seemed firmly established. Princess Anne, known throughout her life for her no-nonsense approach and fierce loyalty to the crown, had been unusually quiet in the days leading up to this gathering. Those close to the royal family had noticed a certain gravity in her demeanor, though few could have guessed what she was preparing to reveal. Anne has always been regarded as perhaps the hardest-working member of the royal family, carrying out hundreds of engagements each year with minimal fuss or fanfare. Her commitment to duty is legendary, and her relationship with her brother Charles had deepened significantly during his final years. As the family settled into their seats, Anne produced a letter bearing the royal seal. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. In an institution where protocol governs nearly every interaction, the presence of a personal letter at such a gathering was highly unusual. Anne announced that she would read the contents in full, explaining that it contained Charles's personal wishes for the family and the future of the monarchy. Camilla's reaction was reportedly one of visible discomfort. According to those familiar with the events, she attempted to interject, suggesting that such matters might be better discussed in a different setting, or perhaps reviewed privately first. Her concern was understandable given the circumstances. Personal letters from deceased monarchs have historically carried significant weight, and the contents of such documents can have far-reaching implications for royal succession and the distribution of responsibilities within the family. Anne, however, was resolute. Her loyalty to Charles and her determination to honor his final wishes overrode any concerns about the discomfort his words might cause. As she began reading, the room fell into complete silence. The letter was not the gentle, reflective piece many had expected. Instead, it contained direct statements about Charles's vision for the monarchy's future and specific instructions regarding the roles various family members should play. The language Charles used was reportedly both personal and authoritative. Unlike the carefully worded public statements that typically emerge from Buckingham Palace, this was an unfiltered expression of the king's true thoughts. He had written it during his final months, a period when he had been reflecting deeply on his legacy and the future of the institution he had spent his entire life preparing to lead. As Anne continued reading, the weight of Charles's words became increasingly apparent. This was not merely a father's advice to his children or a monarch's general guidance for his successors. It was a specific directive, carefully considered and deliberately phrased to leave little room for alternative interpretation. The king had made decisions about the future structure of royal responsibilities, and he had entrusted Anne alone with ensuring these wishes were known. The moment when Camilla's composure finally broke has been described by those present as shocking. Here was a woman who had weathered decades of public criticism, who had gradually won over skeptics through persistence and careful image management, suddenly confronted with a reality she had not anticipated. The color drained from her face as Anne read the final passages of the letter. Her breathing became labored, and within moments, she collapsed. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Staff members rushed to assist, and there was genuine concern for her well-being. However, beneath the surface emergency, a deeper realization was spreading through the room. The letter had fundamentally altered the expected trajectory of the monarchy. Whatever plans had been in place, whatever assumptions had been made about the future distribution of power and responsibility within the royal family, Charles's words had upended them all. For years, observers of the royal family had speculated about the dynamics between different family members. The relationship between Charles and Camilla had been one of the most scrutinized aspects of royal life, from their early relationship through Diana's death, and eventually to their marriage in 2005. Camilla's gradual acceptance by the public and her eventual designation as queen consort rather than princess consort had seemed to settle questions about her role. Yet this letter suggested that Charles himself had harbored doubts or had come to different conclusions about what the monarchy needed going forward. The timing of the letter's revelation was significant. In the immediate aftermath of a monarch's death, there is typically a period of transition where established protocols guide the family and the institution through the change. However, a direct written instruction from the deceased king carried a weight that transcended normal procedure. It represented his final thoughts, composed when he knew his time was limited, and when the urgency of securing the monarchy's future was at its most acute. Anne's decision to read the letter at this particular gathering, with the full family present, was clearly deliberate. By making the contents known to everyone simultaneously, she eliminated the possibility of the message being filtered, reinterpreted, or diluted through private discussions. It was a direct communication from Charles to his family, delivered exactly as he had intended it to be heard. The shock that rippled through Windsor that day extended beyond just Camilla's personal reaction. Every person present understood they were witnessing a pivotal moment in royal history. The British monarchy has evolved over centuries, adapting to changing times while maintaining core traditions. However, this evolution typically happens gradually, through careful negotiation and consensus building. Charles's letter had introduced an element of disruption into what is normally a carefully managed process. What made this moment particularly significant was that it came from Charles himself. This was not an external force imposing change on the monarchy, nor was it younger generations pushing for reform. It was the king, drawing on his lifetime of experience and observation, making a final determination about what he believed the institution needed to survive and thrive in the modern era. To understand the full significance of what Princess Anne revealed that day at Windsor, it is necessary to look back at the final months of King Charles's life and the circumstances that led him to write such a consequential letter. Those closest to the king during this period observed a man grappling not just with his mortality, but with deep concerns about the future of the institution he had devoted his entire life to serving. Charles's final months were marked by a quiet intensity that few outside his inner circle witnessed. While public appearances were carefully managed to project stability and continuity, behind palace doors the king was engaged in profound reflection. He had waited longer than any heir in British history to assume the throne, ascending at the age of 73 after a lifetime of preparation. Now, facing the reality that his reign would be shorter than he might have hoped, he felt a pressing need to ensure that his vision for the monarchy would endure beyond his death. During this period, Charles's relationship with his sister Anne took on a new dimension. The two had always shared a bond rooted in their understanding of royal duty. But as Charles's health declined, their conversations became more frequent and more intimate. Anne would visit him in his private chambers, away from the constant presence of advisors and staff members. These meetings were not recorded in the official court calendar, and no stenographers were present to document what was discussed. Those who worked closely with both siblings noticed the change. Anne, typically brisk and focused on her packed schedule of royal engagements, began clearing her calendar for extended periods. She would arrive at the palace in the evening and sometimes not leave until well after midnight. The substance of these conversations remained private, but their frequency and duration suggested something significant was taking shape. Charles confided in Anne thoughts he could share with no one else. He spoke about his fears for the monarchy's future, not in terms of its survival as an institution, but regarding the direction it might take, and who would shape that direction. For the first time, he openly expressed doubts about certain figures in his immediate circle. These were not casual observations, but carefully considered assessments based on years of observation and recent experiences that had given him pause. The question of Camilla's role after his death appears to have weighed particularly heavily on Charles's mind during these final months. Their relationship had defined much of his adult life, and he had worked tirelessly to secure her acceptance, both within the family and among the British public. The decision to designate her as Queen Consort rather than Princess Consort had been seen as a significant statement about her position. However, Charles's private reflections suggested a more complicated picture. In his conversations with Anne, Charles reportedly discussed concerns about the vision Camilla held for the monarchy's future. These were not accusations of malice or incompetence, but rather a growing sense that their fundamental understanding of what the institution needed had begun to diverge. Charles had spent decades developing his own philosophy about the monarchy's role in modern Britain, influenced by his interests in architecture, environmental conservation, and interfaith dialogue. He questioned whether Camilla shared this vision, or whether she saw the institution primarily through the lens of personal position and influence. It was during this period of intense reflection that Charles began working on the letter. He did not dictate it to secretaries or discuss its contents with legal advisors. Instead, he retreated to his private study and wrote it himself in longhand. This personal approach was highly unusual for a monarch, whose official communications typically passed through multiple layers of review and revision. But Charles clearly felt that this message needed to be his own words, unfiltered and unpolished. The process of writing took several weeks. Charles would work on it late at night, often after his official duties were complete. Staff members noticed lights burning in his study well past midnight. Anne was occasionally present during these sessions, though she has never publicly discussed what role, if any, she played in shaping the letter's contents. What is clear is that Charles viewed this document as perhaps the most important thing he would ever write. While Charles was drafting his final wishes, Camilla was continuing to build and consolidate her position within the royal structure. Her journey to this point had been extraordinary by any measure. She had entered the royal sphere not as a princess born into the role, or a commoner who married into it with public approval, but as a figure initially regarded with suspicion and even hostility by large segments of the British public. The comparison to Diana was inevitable and, for many years, unfavorable. Diana's popularity had been immense, and her death had crystallized her status as a beloved figure in the public imagination. Camilla faced the daunting task of establishing her own identity and legitimacy in the shadow of this legacy. She approached this challenge with patience and strategic thinking, carefully managing her public image and gradually shifting perceptions through consistent, low-key appearances and charitable work. Behind the scenes, Camilla had proven herself to be politically astute. She understood how the palace machinery worked and knew which relationships mattered. Over time, she built a network of allies among courtiers, advisors, and influential figures in British society. These relationships were cultivated carefully, through private dinners, discreet consultations, and the kind of personal attention that creates loyalty. By the time Charles became king, Camilla had established herself as a force within the institution, someone whose views carried weight and whose approval was sought on important matters. Her confidence in her position was not without foundation. She had survived decades of scrutiny and had seen her public approval ratings gradually improve. Opinion polls showed that while she would never achieve Diana-level popularity, a majority of Britons had come to accept her role. This acceptance had been hard-won, and Camilla appeared determined to ensure that it translated into lasting influence. Those close to Camilla during this period describe a woman who had come to see herself as an integral part of the monarchy's future. She reportedly spoke about her role in shaping policy and direction, with an assurance that suggested she expected her influence to continue and even expand after Charles's death. In private conversations with trusted advisors, she is said to have expressed confidence about maintaining a central position, even as William and Catherine's profile grew. This confidence extended to her assessment of the younger generation of royals. While William's popularity was undeniable, and Catherine had won widespread public affection, Camilla apparently believed these factors could be managed and channeled, rather than viewing them as a challenge to her own authority. She saw herself as the experienced hand who could guide the transition, ensuring continuity and stability, while the next generation learned their roles. The contrast between what Camilla was building and what Charles was privately contemplating could not have been starker. While she was consolidating her network and preparing for what she assumed would be her continued prominence, Charles was drafting a document that would fundamentally undermine those assumptions. He was doing so not out of spite or sudden disillusionment, but from what he believed was a clear-eyed assessment of what the monarchy needed to thrive in the coming decades. Anne watched these parallel developments with growing awareness of the collision that was coming. She could see Camilla's confidence growing even as she knew what Charles had written. The burden of this knowledge was considerable. She was carrying a secret that would upend the expectations of someone who had worked for years to establish their position, and she knew that the revelation would come as a devastating shock. Charles made his intentions regarding the letter crystal clear to Anne. It was not to be opened or discussed with anyone until after his death. He specified that it should be revealed to the family in a setting where all key members were present, ensuring that everyone heard his words simultaneously. This was not information to be filtered through intermediaries or softened by diplomatic rephrasing. It was his final statement, and he wanted it delivered with full force and clarity. As Charles's health continued to decline, the sealed letter became a physical presence in Anne's life, a tangible reminder of the responsibility he had placed on her shoulders. She understood that when the moment came to reveal its contents, she would face intense pressure and possibly fierce resistance. But her loyalty to Charles and her own sense of duty to the monarchy meant that she would not waver. The letter represented her brother's final wishes, and she would ensure those wishes were honored, regardless of the personal cost or the discomfort it would cause. The decision about when to reveal Charles's letter was one that Anne had to make carefully. In the days following his death, the palace was consumed with the immediate protocols of royal succession. There were official announcements to be made, ceremonies to plan, and the complex machinery of transferring power from one monarch to the next. In the midst of all this activity, Anne watched and waited, knowing that the letter she carried would disrupt everything once its contents became known. She observed the dynamics within the family with heightened awareness. Camilla had moved quickly to assert herself in various decisions, taking a more prominent role in discussions about memorial arrangements and future plans. Her confidence was evident in the way she offered opinions and made suggestions, clearly positioning herself as a key decision-maker in this transitional period. To those unfamiliar with what Charles had written, this seemed entirely natural. She was the queen consort, after all, and it made sense that she would have significant input. William, meanwhile, was navigating his own complex emotions. He had lost his father and simultaneously inherited a new level of responsibility as heir to the throne. Those around him noted that he seemed preoccupied, as if sensing that something remained unresolved. On one particular evening, away from the formal gatherings and official business, he approached Anne privately. He did not ask directly about a letter. but his question suggested an instinct that his father had left behind something important that the family needed to know. Anne's response was measured. She did not reveal the letter's contents at that moment, but her manner conveyed that William's instincts were correct. It was a delicate balance she was maintaining, honoring Charles's specific instructions about how and when the letter should be revealed, while also acknowledging the legitimate concerns of family members who sensed something significant was being withheld. Catherine's role during this period proved unexpectedly important. She had always been known for her careful observation and emotional intelligence, qualities that served her well as she watched the various currents moving through the family. Without knowing specifically what Anne was carrying, Catherine seemed to understand that the Princess Royal was bearing a particular burden. She offered quiet support, standing beside Anne at gatherings and providing a kind of silent solidarity that Anne clearly appreciated. This connection would prove significant in the days ahead. The official memorial gathering was scheduled for several weeks after Charles's death, once the most immediate ceremonial obligations had been fulfilled. It was to be a private family event, bringing together all the senior royals in one place for an extended period. Anne recognized this as the moment Charles had envisioned. The setting would provide the gravitas appropriate for such a revelation, and the presence of the entire family meant that no one could later claim they had been excluded or that the information had been selectively shared. The night before the gathering, Anne spent considerable time alone, rereading the letter and preparing herself for what was to come. She knew that the reaction would be intense, and that Camilla in particular would be devastated. There was no pleasure in this knowledge, only a sense of duty to her brother and to his vision for the monarchy's future. She had considered every possible way the situation might unfold, every objection that might be raised, every attempt that might be made to minimize or reinterpret Charles's words. When the family assembled the following day, the atmosphere was one of solemn remembrance, mixed with the underlying tension that had been building since Charles's death. Camilla entered with the bearing of someone who expected this to be a milestone in cementing her position. She had dressed carefully and carried herself with the confidence of a woman who believed she understood her role in the monarchy's future. Anne allowed the initial formalities to proceed. There were brief speeches and shared memories, the kind of gentle tributes that are common at such gatherings. Then, as the room settled into a reflective quiet, Anne stood and announced that she had something to share. She explained that Charles had written a personal letter during his final months, one that he had entrusted to her, with specific instructions about when and how it should be revealed. The shift in the room's energy was immediate and palpable. Camilla's expression changed noticeably. Those present later described seeing uncertainty cross her face for the first time in years. She attempted to speak, suggesting perhaps that such a personal document might be reviewed privately first, or that certain matters might be better handled through established channels. But Anne had anticipated this response. She explained calmly that Charles's instructions had been explicit, and that she was carrying out his wishes exactly as he had specified. As Anne began reading, Charles's voice seemed to fill the room through her words. He had written with characteristic thoughtfulness, beginning with reflections on his life and his gratitude for his family. But as the letter progressed, its tone became more direct. Charles addressed the future of the monarchy directly, expressing his considered views on what the institution needed and who he believed was best positioned to provide it. The critical passage came roughly halfway through the letter. Charles stated clearly and unambiguously that upon his death, Camilla should step back from active involvement in royal affairs. He expressed appreciation for her companionship and support during his life, but made it explicit that his vision for the monarchy going forward did not include her at its center. The language he used left no room for alternative interpretation. This was not a suggestion open to negotiation, but a clear directive from a king about how he wanted the institution to proceed after his death. Camilla's face went pale as Anne read these words. Her hands gripped the arms of her chair, and her breathing became visibly strained. Around the room, other family members sat in stunned silence, processing what they were hearing. This was not what anyone had expected. Royal transitions typically follow established patterns, with roles and responsibilities shifting gradually and predictably. Charles's letter was upending all of those assumptions. Anne continued reading as Charles laid out his vision for the monarchy's leadership. He spoke directly about William and Catherine, describing them as embodying the qualities the institution would need in the coming decades. He praised their dedication, their connection with the public, and their understanding of how the monarchy needed to evolve while maintaining its essential character. In Charles's view, they represented the future, and the transition to their leadership should begin immediately rather than being delayed by intermediate arrangements. The letter also addressed Anne's own role, though in characteristically understated terms. Charles described his sister as the moral compass of the family, someone whose judgment he trusted completely, and whose commitment to duty was beyond question. He expressed his wish that she serve as a guide and advisor, as William and Catherine assumed greater responsibilities, providing continuity and institutional memory during the transition. As Anne read the final paragraphs, Camilla's composure finally broke completely. The combination of shock, humiliation, and the sudden collapse of everything she had built proved too much. She slumped forward in her chair, her breathing shallow and rapid. Within moments, medical staff who were always present at such gatherings rushed to her side. The gathering dissolved into chaos as people moved to help. Though beneath the immediate crisis, everyone present understood that something far more significant than a medical emergency had just occurred. William sat motionless, his face reflecting the complexity of his emotions. He had lost his father, and now he was confronting the reality that Charles had made decisions about the family's future without consulting those most affected. Catherine reached for his hand, her own eyes glistening with tears that reflected not triumph, but recognition of the enormous responsibility that had just been placed on their shoulders. The immediate aftermath saw the family dividing into clusters of urgent whispered conversations. Some moved to assist Camilla, while others stood apart, clearly trying to process the implications of what they had just heard. Palace advisors who had been present began quietly making phone calls, alerting senior staff that the situation had fundamentally changed and that plans would need to be reassessed. Anne remained standing, the letter still in her hands. She had done what Charles asked of her, delivering his final wishes exactly as he had instructed. The weight of that responsibility was evident in her bearing, but so was her resolve. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever resistance or criticism she might face, she had honored her brother's trust. The letter was now part of the royal record, its contents known to all who needed to hear them, and the process of implementing Charles's vision could begin. The revelation of Charles's letter sent shockwaves through the palace that extended far beyond the immediate family gathering. Within hours, news of what had transpired began circulating among senior staff, advisors, and key figures within the royal household. While the specific contents of the letter were not immediately made public, those who worked within the palace system understood that something fundamental had shifted. The carefully maintained equilibrium of royal life had been disrupted, and the institution now faced a period of significant realignment. In the days that followed, distinct factions began to emerge within the palace structure. On one side were those whose positions and influence had been closely tied to Camilla. These individuals had spent years building relationships with her, understanding that their access and authority derived in part from her favor. The letter's contents threatened not just Camilla's position, but the entire network of relationships and power structures that had developed around her. They began quietly meeting to discuss how the situation might be managed, whether there were procedural grounds to question the letter's authority, or if alternative interpretations of Charles's words might be possible. Opposing this group were those who saw the letter as a sacred directive that must be honored without qualification. Many of these individuals had deep institutional loyalty to the monarchy itself, rather than to any particular person within it. They viewed Charles's final wishes as carrying an authority that transcended normal palace politics. Anne naturally became the focal point for this faction, though she herself resisted being seen as leading any kind of political movement. Her position was simple and unwavering. She was merely executing her brother's clearly stated wishes. The question of the letter's legal and constitutional standing became a subject of intense private debate. Royal lawyers were consulted about precedents and protocols. Could a personal letter from a deceased monarch carry binding authority? The British Constitution, being largely unwritten and based on precedent and convention, offered no clear answer. Some argued that Charles's wishes, while certainly important and worthy of respect, could not override the established structures and roles that had been formally designated during his lifetime. Others contended that the final wishes of a monarch, especially when so clearly and deliberately stated, carried a moral and institutional weight that the family was obligated to honor. Camilla's response to the crisis evolved over several days. The initial medical emergency had been real enough, the shock of the letter's contents having genuine physical effects. But once she had recovered from the immediate trauma, her approach became more calculated. She recognized that direct confrontation or public displays of anger would only weaken her position further. Instead, she adopted a strategy of quiet persistence, working through intermediaries and allies to raise questions about the letter's interpretation and implementation. Her first significant move was to request a private meeting with Anne. This conversation, which took place in Anne's private apartments, was by all accounts intense and emotional. Camilla argued that the letter reflected Charles's thoughts at a particular moment, but might not represent his final considered judgment. She suggested that illness and medication might have influenced his thinking, or that he had not fully considered the practical implications of what he was proposing. She urged Anne to consider a more gradual transition that would allow for continuity and stability. Anne's response was firm and unequivocal. She had been present during many of Charles's final months and had witnessed firsthand the clarity and deliberation with which he had approached the letter. There had been no confusion, no impairment of judgment. Charles had known exactly what he was writing and why. Anne made it clear that she would not participate in any effort to reinterpret or soften his words. The letter said what it said, and her duty was to ensure his wishes were carried out, not to negotiate them based on whose feelings might be hurt or whose plans might be disrupted. Frustrated by Anne's refusal to compromise, Camilla's allies began approaching other family members and senior palace officials. They raised procedural questions and sought legal opinions that might support their position. Some suggested that the matter should be referred to the Privy Council or other governmental bodies for guidance. Others proposed that the letter should be treated as advisory rather than directive, something to be considered alongside other factors rather than accepted as the final word on royal arrangements. These efforts gained little traction, largely because of William's intervention. The Prince of Wales had spent the days since the letter's revelation in careful reflection. He had consulted with Catherine, spoken at length with Anne, and considered his father's words from every angle. When he finally made his position clear, it proved decisive. In both private conversations and more formal settings, William stated that he believed his father's letter represented a thoughtful and considered judgment about what the monarchy needed. He announced his intention to honor those wishes fully and to work toward implementing the vision Charles had laid out. William's support fundamentally changed the dynamic. As the heir to the throne and an enormously popular figure both within the palace and among the British public, his endorsement of the letter's contents carried immense weight. Those who had been quietly exploring ways to circumvent or reinterpret Charles's wishes now found themselves facing not just Anne's determination, but the united front of Anne and William together. The balance of power had shifted decisively. Catherine's role during this period was subtle but significant. Rather than engaging directly in the political maneuvering, she focused on the public dimension of the situation. Through carefully managed appearances and strategic communications, she helped shape how the broader public understood what was happening. While the specific contents of Charles's letter remained private, the general narrative that emerged emphasized themes of renewal, generational transition, and respect for the late king's vision. Catherine's natural grace and the genuine affection the public felt for her helped frame the changes as positive evolution rather than destructive upheaval. As William and Catherine's positions strengthened, Camilla's allies began to reconsider their stance. Palace life operates on careful calculation of where power lies and which relationships are worth maintaining. As it became clear that fighting the letter's implementation was a losing battle, several key figures who had initially supported Camilla began distancing themselves. They started making their peace with the new reality, seeking to ensure their own positions in the emerging order, rather than going down with a sinking ship. Camilla herself eventually recognized that continued resistance was futile. Her withdrawal from public duties began gradually, but became increasingly noticeable. Events and engagements that she would normally have attended were reassigned to other family members. Her name appeared less frequently in the court circular, the official record of royal activities. There were no dramatic announcements or formal statements about her reduced role. Instead, there was simply a quiet fading from prominence, a slow retreat from the public stage she had worked so hard to occupy. The transition was not without its awkward moments and tensions. Palace staff had to navigate the delicate task of implementing changes while maintaining some semblance of normal operations. Schedules were revised, reporting structures adjusted, and the subtle hierarchies of royal life reconfigured to reflect the new reality. Through it all, Anne remained a steady presence, ensuring that the process stayed true to Charles's intentions, while also working to minimize unnecessary disruption and personal humiliation. William and Catherine stepped into their expanded roles with a mixture of determination and humility. They had not sought this acceleration of their responsibilities, but they accepted it as their duty. Their approach emphasized continuity with Charles's values and priorities, while also bringing their own perspective and energy to royal work. Public response was overwhelmingly positive, with opinion polls showing strong support for their increased prominence and approval of the direction the monarchy was taking. Anne's position evolved into something unique within the royal structure. She became widely recognized as the guardian of Charles's legacy, the person who had ensured his final wishes were honored, despite considerable pressure to do otherwise. Her already strong reputation for dedication and integrity was enhanced by her handling of this difficult situation. She continued her demanding schedule of public engagements, while also serving as an informal advisor to William and Catherine, providing institutional knowledge and guidance as they navigated their new responsibilities. The broader public gradually became aware that significant changes were underway within the royal family, though the full details of Charles's letter remained private. Media coverage focused on the visible shifts in roles and responsibilities, with most commentators viewing the changes as a natural and positive evolution. The narrative that emerged emphasized generational renewal and the monarchy's ability to adapt to changing times while maintaining its essential character. Those closest to the situation understood that what had occurred was far more dramatic than the smooth public presentation suggested. Charles's letter had forced a reckoning within the royal family, compelling them to confront questions about power, loyalty, and the institution's future that might otherwise have been avoided or delayed. The resolution of that crisis had reshaped the monarchy in ways that would influence it for decades to come, establishing a precedent about how seriously a monarch's final wishes should be taken, and demonstrating that even the most carefully constructed positions within the palace could be undone by a clear directive from the crown itself.